You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Overdraft fees are just the worst. Get up to $200 in fee-free overdraft with the Chime checking account. Sign up today at chime.com/goals24. Banking services and debit card provided by the Bancorp Bank N.A. or Stride Bank N.A. Members FDIC. Spot me eligibility requirements and overdraft limits apply.
In other words, you're running for president whether you want it or not. It was true that most 19th century candidates were supposed to show disinterest in the presidency when they were getting nominated, but with Horatio Seymour, it was taken to a new limit. He really did not want the presidency, nor even his party's nomination for it. But in the 1868 Democratic Convention, Tammany Hall in New York City, there was an issue. George Pendleton, who had turned off Union soldiers in 1864 as the Peace Democrat. He was leading. He was charismatic. A lot of Democrats liked him, but enough didn't to withhold a majority from him. Andrew Johnson, the current president, was a possibility, but not all Democrats trust him. He had run with Lincoln on the Union ticket and attacked Democrats in Tennessee. Samuel Chase, Supreme Court Justice, Chief, he was a possibility too, but he was a former Republican again and attacked Democrats. Senator Thomas A. Hendricks of Indiana was a possibility, but no one could get the 212 needed for 15 ballots. Then Winfield Scott's even, Hancock, Union General, is thrown in. He gets past Pendleton and takes Pendleton out, but he doesn't get the 212 to win. So on the fourth ballot, something, notable happens, but not significant yet. The chair of the convention, Horatio Seymour himself, who's sitting there in the middle of the convention at the desk, gets 9 votes. Well, the chairman makes a note into the record. The last vote contained votes for me. I must not be nominated by this convention. I declined on the outset. I cannot allow my name to be mentioned against my protest. So the party keeps voting. They get to 25 ballots, and then the state of Ohio gives all its votes. These are the Pendleton votes, where the Pendleton campaign has collapsed. All its votes to Horatio Seymour. It figures New York, its home state, will also. That'll start momentum, and that'll at least wrap up the convention with a candidate everyone likes. Clement Vallandigham says, "In times of great public exigency and calamity, all must sacrifice." There are cheers as he says, Ohio cannot, will not accept the chairman's declaration. In other words, you're running for president whether you want it or not. Seymour gets up again. I have no terms, he says, with which to express my gratitude for all of the good words said about me, he says. I'd give my life for my country. And I identify that life with the Democratic Party. Then someone screams at him, then take the nomination. I do not stand here as a man proud of his opinions or obstinate in his purposes, but it is a question of my duty and honor, and I must stand in my opinions against the world. There are cheers for him. Then he says, when I said I could not be a candidate, I meant it. He goes on, thank God there is a state of Ohio, and this and that, but essentially he refuses again. The convention goes on for a few ballots, but does not accept his declination, and despite his own wishes, Horatio Seymour is the Democratic candidate. It was unanimous. A robust election occurred, focused mostly on the issue of Reconstruction, how the Southern states would be treated. Republicans hinted that Horatio Seymour might be insane. His father had committed suicide. Meanwhile, the Seymour ticket appeals to racial solidarity, to white men. The Seymour-Blair ticket wins New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Kentucky, Oregon, Maryland, but not enough to beat Ulysses S. Grant and his strength in all the other states. Grant wins 214 to 80 electoral votes. But considering Grant was a war hero, and we're coming right off the Civil War, and most of the votes are in Union states or Union-controlled states, this is a concerning election for Republicans. Seymour gets 48% of the Connecticut votes. Same with Pennsylvania and Indiana. He's real close there. 49% of California's votes. And the ticket wins Georgia. 1868 becomes both the Reconstruction era election and the beginning of the end for Reconstruction, partially because of this result. A lot of Republicans in the North are seeing the writing on the wall. They're not going to be able to maintain this Reconstruction policy and keep winning elections. Nonetheless, a win is a win is a win. And Grant's campaign put out these campaign cards that look like it was a business card they were handing out. Grant and Colfax, Tanners, Washington, D.C., and it read, "Respectfully inform the people of the United States they will be engaged in tanning old Democratic hides until the 3rd day of November." But it goes on. "The senior member of this firm, having experience in this business, tanning Democratic hides, thinks that with the help of his partner, Colfax, all work will be done in a satisfactory manner. References? See Robert E. Lee." Horatio Seymour loses this election that he didn't want to run in, and it's good for humanity because right after, the 15th Amendment guarantees the right to vote regardless of race. Seymour keeps saying no to offices. He wasn't kidding. He turns down a run for Senate and governor, and he stays an elder statesman. He'll live for 20 more years. You can't say that about Grant's next opponent, Horace Greeley. For all the talk in recent years about age in the presidency, Greeley is the only major presidential candidate not to make it to the Electoral College, to even receive his votes. It starts out well. The Grant administration, in 4 years of service, manages to anger a significant group of Republicans called Reform Republicans, Liberal Republicans, their own party. And they're mad about civil service, about patronage, the way the Grant administration is running things, corruption, and policy towards the South. And they run their own convention in 1872. They do not nominate Grant. They meet in Cincinnati to decide who they will nominate. Everyone thinks it's going to be Charles Francis Adams to run as Liberal Republican Party candidate. He's the son of John Quincy Adams, son of a president. This is the family dynasty, the last chance we are going to see at this family to get a president. He was minister to England and minister to Great Britain during the Lincoln administration. Charles Francis Adams had a significant role in keeping the United States and England out of war and keeping England out of the Civil War, and then negotiated the Alabama claims with Great Britain. If you're keeping in track of the Adamses, his grandson, he is the grandson of John Adams, the president, obviously son of the other president, and his son Henry is the historian. So Adams is a candidate. So is Governor Gatz Brown of Missouri, who has been disappointed with the Republican Party. Lincoln, no longer alive at this point, of course, has a couple of his friends running, Illinois Judge David Davis and Lynn Trumbull. Both were Lincoln friends. But a few people start talking about another candidate. Perhaps we could run the editor, Horace Greeley, of the New York Tribune. See, Greeley would be considered a megastar in 1872. Everyone's going to know his name. His pen is read by so many. Whitelaw Reid, another editor at the Tribune, will run his convention effort. And it gets a little wild for this new party in Cincinnati. The first thing that happens is Lynn Trumbull drops out. And then Governor Gratz makes a deal with Whitelaw Reid. I'll drop out and favor your man Greeley if you run me as vice president. And soon Greeley overtakes Charles Francis Adams. Greeley's in the lead and eventually wins. Everyone's surprised by this. No one expected Horace Greeley to get a presidential nomination. Some liberal Republicans are mad. They are free traders, low tariff people, and Greeley's a high tariff protectionist. Greeley's also a little weird. He's a vegetarian. He has thousands of printed statements that can be used against him. When a strange result happens at a party convention like this, some might say like, oh, they were all drunk. But actually, the opposite criticism is leveled at the liberal Republican Party in Cincinnati. This is an egghead choice, as we might say now. It's more, they say then, the problem with this convention, there were more brains than whiskey. But there is another side to this. I'm always kind of going against the textbook a bit, or trying to enliven the textbook history a bit and reminding people that hindsight is 20/20. So if you go back at this time, you have to remember, Greeley's not a name that you're going to have to tell people who he is. He's the most read editor in the land. His name is just up there, and you are running against a superstar of the time, Ulysses S. Grant, the hero general. So who do you run against him? Your megastar. So that's one thing. I mean, Rutherford B. Hayes is looking at this election. He's not president-elect. That's going to happen later. He's governor of Ohio, and he's looking at it and saying, Greeley could win this. And what happens next adds even more fuel to that fire. It's something that will never happen again. The Democrats meet in Baltimore. They bang a gavel and then merely decide, okay, we will not field candidates. We're not going to go into a three-way scrum and get beaten. We could do that and just raise the party banner, but we don't have anybody, and we're not going to. So the Democrats simply nominate Horace Greeley and Gatz Brown in one of the fastest Democratic Party convention ever held. They just accept the liberal Republican ticket. A few Democrats are mad about this. Greeley had fought Democrats all his life. Here's another thing that's amazing about Horace Greeley as a candidate for president in 1872. He does something new. He calls for reunification of the country, for the North and South to get together. Now, this is an issue that you really have to contextualize in this time. He wants complete amnesty for anyone who had a rifle in that war, that they can vote, that Confederate soldiers or officers can run for federal office. But this is mixed with something else, which makes Greeley highly interesting. Greeley is also an advocate on record for equal rights for everyone, regardless of race. And he does something else. He will make no apologies about it. He will hit the stump. He is a speaker. He is an editor. His opinions are known. He's always voiced his opinions. He's not going to be silent now. That would be foolish. The campaign will go forth, and there will be campaign songs like The Man in the White Hat to Save Us and The Friend of Freedom, Horace Greeley. He's mostly going to get support in the South, though some Democrats are upset. It's like worshiping Mohammed instead of God, one Democratic writer says. A choice of hemlock and strychnine, says another. A man with too many ideas against a man with none. Things do start to go bad, though, for Greeley and his running mate especially. Gatz Brown turns out to be an embarrassment. He shows up at the New York Liberal Republican Club to make his big speech as vice presidential candidate. Most haven't seen this man because he's been a Western governor. He shows up drunk and continues with his speech. Then, at Yale University, he throws up. Must have been something I ate, etc. Not only that, one of Greeley's big issues is that he'll give the votes to Confederates and will offer amnesty to them in order to try to unify the country after war. Congress does this with a few exceptions in the summer to deprive Greeley of this issue. Greeley does pick up an issue when the Credit Mobilier scandal is discovered, with congressmen having been bought on the floor of the House, and most of them are allied with Grant. This doesn't look good. But then it's found that in Greeley's history, he has purchased railroad stock and then promoted the railroad in his newspaper that he purchased stock of. Plus, he's attacked for accepting Democratic support. A Harper's cartoon showed him shaking hands with John Wilkes Booth over Lincoln's grave, ignoring that Greeley had always supported equal rights for all races. And while he wasn't always a Lincoln supporter or supporter of how he prosecuted the war like many people in the North, he had supported him against McClellan in 1864. Something else happens. Greeley's wife dies during the campaign. She had been ill, and not only is Greeley forced to stop campaigning and loses that one magic weapon he has, that he's a candidate who can hit the stump and speak to audiences, perhaps personally affect the result. He's broken. He's also exhausted, and Grant's campaign is too well organized. He loses that election badly. We have been beaten badly, he says. Greeley was exhausted, stressed. Even his own newspaper is being taken away from him as Whitelaw Reid becomes the key editor. He dies before the Electoral College is able to meet in December. His death is greatly mourned in America. Grant, of course, is at his funeral. Everyone mourns him, and his electoral votes are given to other candidates, some to Gatz Brown. Those that came from the South are given to Thomas Hendricks of Indiana. But at least Greeley knew that he was running a campaign for president with Rufus King, Federalist, in quotes, candidate, in quotes, from New York, and possibly the last Federalist candidate in 1816. We don't know. There may or may not have been a campaign. There also may or may not have been a summer. 1816 is a really weird year around the world. Europe had only cold weather, even in the summer. Thomas Jefferson and others in America note about the horrible summer here. There's really no hot weather in July and August. It's worse in Europe. It's ruining farm crops. Not as bad with that in America, but ruins them there. It might be, scientists now think, a volcano eruption that happens in Indonesia that created the conditions around the world, but it wasn't well known then. For the Federalist Party, they had their own disaster, their political volcano, the Hartford Convention during the War of 1812, where people met in Connecticut, associated with the Federalists, and seemed to be against the American cause. Never looked good. Seemed to threaten disunion, working with Britain, even though they weren't. But it hurt the party's chances. You never saw Federalists after that, be a significant force. By the tail end of Jefferson's presidency, even Adams and his son John Quincy were supporting Republicans in Massachusetts. So you can think of Rufus King, who is in the history books as James Monroe's opponent in 1816, as the last Federalist. I mean, he says, I am a Federalist in the sense of Hamilton, and in the sense James Madison once was, and I always will be. Yeah, King never gives up the fight of this old aging party. When 1816 comes around, Madison is president, and the Congressional Caucus picks James Monroe. There are some groans. Another Virginian? Imagine, 4 presidents in a row from California, right? Separated perhaps by one from New York. How would Americans like that? This is a very long time. 28 years of having presidents at all, and most of them are from Virginia. Virginia, Massachusetts, Virginia, 28 years. But Monroe was Secretary of State and Secretary of War in Madison's administration. Gets some credit for the defense of Baltimore during the War of 1812, for an organized retreat that may have helped save the president's life in the War of 1812. So he was going to win. For the Federalists, Connecticut newspapers would say that we should be willing to concede national offices and just focus on local ones. And this is where Rufus King comes in. It's very popular. He's a senator from New York. He does run for governor of New York. But this King does reluctantly. He'd rather that the Federalists become more of a political constituency than a party. In other words, they will pick the least wicked section of the Jeffersonian Republicans or the Madisonian Republicans and side with that less wicked faction to determine who will win elections. They can be more influential. When they run him, he says to some, I hope we will not make a fruitless struggle. But he's flooded with letters. If you decline, it will be the end of the federal party, one writes him. He does run for governor, and he loses in a 3-way race. So we have evidence of letters around that race for governor in 1816. What we don't have is any idea that there's a presidential campaign. It's after the gubernatorial election that electors in state capitals meet and support mostly Monroe and Tompkins. And electors of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Delaware vote for Rufus King. That's why it shows up in the history books as if it was Rufus King against James Monroe. But per Edward Skeen's 1816 America Rising, no caucus was held by the Federalists, no Federalist nominee ever made, and nothing in King's correspondence says he's a presidential candidate. John Randolph of Virginia found 1816 dull, duller than a state legislature election, 10 times duller. There was no bother in any way to excite the community over the presidential race. There was no reason to. But any election atlases have to have their formatting, so you see King versus Monroe. It's more likely King didn't run it at all, though he didn't seem to protest the votes either. The most exciting thing that happens in the non-election of 1816 is the counting of Indiana's votes. Indiana cast electoral votes, 3 for Monroe. But a senator objects. When the Congress gets together to count the votes, and Henry Clay, who's the Speaker of the House, is the head of the joint session of Congress. That means the Senate and the House getting together to count the votes. Only senators can object. A senator does. Indiana was not yet a state when the Electoral College happened. It was a territory still. Because Congress is in joint session, though, Henry Clay is presiding. He rules that they cannot decide the matter. In this body. They can only perform their constitutional function. So it's sent back to the House. The House decides to approve the votes of Indiana. And then it's sent for the Senate, which counts the vote. There is no reason at all that even that incident in 1816 is important, except to emphasize and to remember, in case there is any election disputes in the future, that this is one step not talked about a lot. It is the Congress that ends up counting electoral votes, not popular votes, electoral votes. And so both in 1860, there's actually a problem in 1820 with Missouri's votes, a similar thing, where they were still a territory when they cast the votes, but in this case, they're just quickly accepted. The only thing that the Congress decides to do in that case is to produce 2 vote counts, one with Missouri and one without, and then demonstrating that Monroe would be president in either case. They accept those votes. Monroe's next election would be a bigger landslide, and therefore not that important to talk about. There isn't even an attempt to run an opponent, if there even was in 1816. But nonetheless, it does provide an interesting footnote of a story. Through a lot of history, maybe even your high school books, I'd have to re-listen to all my cast, maybe in some of the early ones. I may have even told the story of this way. We were told that Monroe in 1820 gets all the electoral votes, all of them, except for one. That's a fact. That's true. And you may have been told that one elector voted against Monroe only to preserve the tradition that Washington's legacy to be the only president to receive all of the electoral votes in an election. The only president elected unanimously. And it's a nice story. Washington certainly deserves it, I guess, but it has no basis in reality. It's not the elector's story, which was documented at the time. It's later history books riffing off each other and telling the same incorrect story, starting in the 1880s, after one person speculates that that's the reason the elector voted against Monroe. Others follow. One book even consulted the memory of a judge, and the judge said he could think of no other explanation that he ever heard that people voted that way in 1820. The problem was the judge was 15 years old at the time of the election. So how would he know? Really, it's just bad history work. A journal of the Mississippi Valley History Review delved into this. And William Plummer is that elector. He's an elector from New Hampshire. He's a maverick, but he's not a fluke. He's an important person. He's the former governor of New Hampshire. He's 61 in 1820. He's a leader of Republicans in the state. He was not asked to be an elector and not consulted on how he would vote. He was automatically added to the group of electors that would meet in Concord, the state capital in December 1820 because of his stature as a former governor. Having not been consulted, the Monroe supporters in New Hampshire assume everyone, of course, meeting in Concord, is going to vote for the Republican ticket. The only one, the Concord Patriot, had said, "Of course all will vote for Monroe and Tompkins." And it goes further. "New Hampshire has not in its bosom a son so degenerate as to forget our national benefactors." The writer had no idea of what William Plumbing's feelings were. He thought Monroe did a horrible job, and he told his fellow electors at the Electoral College meeting about the extravagances of spending. And he felt that was what led to the recent panic, the Panic of 1819. And Tompkins, the VP candidate, was even worse in his opinion. The VP was a drunk. Instead, Plummer votes for John Quincy Adams. He is attacked by the friendly New York newspaper of Vice President Tompkins that he was acting for reasons lacking sense. This was all in Plummer's biography, which was available to those late 19th century historians, but some of them didn't consult it, and then they were riffing off each other. You see a few books in the 20th century that start to correct this, but legend dies hard, and you'll still see that people will say it was because preserving Washington's tradition, and not because of politics. So even in the era of good feelings, where there supposedly was no disagreement, right? There certainly was, but there was less party disagreement. Monroe was not reelected in a perfect electoral college, and this preserves Washington's legacy even more because he truly wasn't reelected in a perfect electoral college. There was actually dissent. When Hiram Johnson was suggested for the vice presidency in 1920 to run with Warren Harding, this is before the convention picked Coolidge, he didn't want any part of it. He doesn't even want to take the phone call, but he does. And a reporter's in the room. "Hello? Hello? Johnson speaking." "No. No. 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 Not in a million years. No, I tell you." "Oh, yes." "No, sirree. For the last time. No. No." Scotch in hand, the senator from California throws down the telephone. Jimmy Montage, a friend in the room, says, "Okay, Hiram, I heard everything you said, all of those no's, but what about the yes in the middle?" "That was when the gentleman asked me if I was sure of what I was saying," Johnson replied.
His karate lessons might not turn him into a black belt. Hi-ya! And even after band camp, he might not be the greatest musician. But with the 3% annual percentage yield you can earn on a PenFed premium online savings account, your goal of supporting his dreams...
Thanks for everything, Mom and Dad.
...will always be worth it. Apply today at PenFed.org/savings. Federally insured by NCUA. $5 minimum to open account. To receive any advertised product, you must become a member of PenFed.
PenFed's got great rates for everyone.
I'm Jane Perlez, longtime foreign correspondent and former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. I've been a foreign correspondent in lots of places: Somalia, Indonesia, Pakistan, but nowhere as important to the world as China.
I mean, China is not dropping anti-democratic paratroopers into Montana. But of course, we did see things like the weather balloon/spy balloon riveting the whole country for a week.
This is Face Off, an 8-part series in which we'll take you behind the scenes to key moments in the tumultuous U.S.-China relationship. We'll speak with a diplomat, a spy, a tech reporter, a U.S. admiral, even Yo-Yo Ma. Plus, my pal and noted China historian Rana Mitter joins the conversation. We'll look at what's driving the two nations apart and explore whether anything can help bring them back together. Face Off launches April 9th.
Calvin Coolidge dealt with a political opponent, probably his toughest during his time as president, but it wasn't John Davis or Robert La Follette who were on the ballot as his opponents in 1924 when he ran for re-election. It was Gifford Pinchot, the governor of Pennsylvania, a friend of, at this time, deceased Theodore Roosevelt, and former head of the National Forest Service, a conservationist. That was featured in Ken Burns' National Parks documentary, if you've watched that. But now in the 1920s, Pinchot had another cause, prohibition. He won his governorship of Pennsylvania in a three-way race, with the Dries solidly behind him. He balanced the budget. He got the admiration of progressives. Coolidge was president and would be up in 1924. But Coolidge got the presidency because he was Harding's vice president. And more than that, he wasn't well respected in Washington. Senators hadn't really known him as vice president. In fact, in the convention, which we should talk about later, the reason Coolidge is chosen is kind of like a popular surge during the convention and not the powers that be picking him. So he's not really in with the Republican establishment. It's wide open for a primary challenge, and Pinchot wants a piece of it. There's a coal strike in Pennsylvania. Calvin Coolidge won't get seriously involved in it. Now, you have to understand, coal is the energy source then. It's going to show up in the heating costs for the populated northeastern part of the country. So coal strike politics is actually figuring into many White Houses at this time. Theodore Roosevelt's going to get involved in resolving a coal strike, and he's going to be the first to put together a meeting of strikers and employers in his first term. McKinley also got involved in these. So this goes back. Coolidge passes, even though GOP congressmen in the Northeast urged the president to get involved. Pinchot urges him to get involved. National problem or not, Pennsylvania mined most of the nation's coal. Plus, it uses a lot of coal too. So Pinchot, as governor, has to get involved now. He's not seeing enough White House action. He waits a little bit, and then he meets with operators and with the United Mine Workers. He began daily meetings between the two sides, but made it clear there can be no strike, and there has to be recognition of the union by the operators. Those were positions that could not be debated that the governor insisted on. Pinchot's a progressive, and he's going to get a lot of progressive support from the types of people that would end up supporting La Follette in the 24 election, that would end up that did support Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. He makes suggestions, too. Even though there was a strike in September 1923, Pinchot made it only a 7-day strike, and a settlement is reached. Pinchot's name is all over the newspapers at this point, and the New York Times makes it clear. Coolidge politically had erred by not intervening. It was a tactical political error. Pinchot is now talked about for the 1924 nomination. It was a decisive action that showed that he could be the chief executive. Now, Coolidge does something smart here, though, something that a president can do. Kill him with praise and take credit. Coolidge says, "Congratulations to solving this very difficult situation in which I invited your cooperation." Some of the press gets word that this telegram is sent, but Pinchot doesn't release the telegraph to the press. Nor does Coolidge. In this case, Coolidge's propensity to be silent hurts him on this political issue, because since Pinchot doesn't release actually what Coolidge says, Coolidge, usually silent, isn't going to be loud here and doesn't release it either. So it's not seen and confirmed by most. Otherwise, it would have been a devastating way for Coolidge to take credit. Progressives are excited. Albert Beveridge, who's Theodore Roosevelt's friend in Congress in the past, telegraphs congratulations. Progressives are not thrilled with Harding. They're less thrilled with Coolidge, who just seem to be continuing Harding's administration. Pinchot has another issue to run on. Here's what Time magazine says at the time. Mr. Pinchot, whose head hives a very busy presidential bee, knows prohibition is an issue with a silver lining. Mr. Coolidge is undoubtedly dry. Mr. Pinchot is therefore more dry, and he hoped to follow the church people to the nomination. He had to be careful, though, attacking a Republican president. So he goes to the Citizenship Council of Churches and says, well, the president needs to take personal enforcement of prohibition. In other words, it's not criticizing Coolidge directly. It's almost saying, you're so good at this job, you need to attend to this matter. But at the same time, it is a criticism. If the president was involved, there wouldn't be so much flouting of the law, Pinchot says. To this group, on this issue, it's as bad as a television negative attack ad is now. At a governor's association meeting, too, he gets his fellow governors to ask the federal government to exercise its full power enforcing prohibition. The states, they say, are powerless. When Coolidge speaks to governors, Pinchot is listening, but then tells the press after the speech that he wasn't specific enough on what he'd do on enforcement. Coolidge needed to take specific steps with manufacturers and with law enforcement that he wasn't naming. Coolidge never takes Pinchot's bait, though. He stays silent Cal. He's for limited government, and that means let states enforce, with help from us, but not a top-down federal effort. He does increase Coast Guard funding to fight rum running. This is where Pinchot is riding on some never-stated rumors that Coolidge is a secret wet, a supporter of free sale of alcohol. See, Coolidge did have breweries in his old state Senate district, and those breweries supported his initial campaigns. Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, as well, was known to hate prohibition. And he's Treasury Secretary. It's his department partially that's enforcing this. He did the minimum. Coolidge really kept discussion of all issues to a minimum. But on prohibition, basically what he would say is, Congress passed Volstead. I support it, referring to the act that enabled prohibition by Congress. But he also was on record saying any law that inspired lawlessness is bad law. So if you're reading the press, winter 23, winter 24, there's a real possibility that Coolidge has a serious primary opponent. But in the end, Pinchot is trapped up. In the end, Pinchot gets tripped up not on the prohibition issue, which is working for him, but on the coal strike. He had resolved that coal strike and got the initial praise, and then prices go up because employers decide, yes, we'll raise union wages slightly, but we're passing it on to consumers. So prices go up, and consumers start feeling it. And Pinchot is widely blamed. Now he turns to what else? To try to get Coolidge to help intervene with the miners to not keep those prices down. Coolidge will not. As The Nation observed, Pinchot received credit for breaking the strike, but Coolidge got the benefit of the tranquility that resulted from it, and Pinchot's presidential prospects quickly faded. There is a prohibitionist party that runs against Coolidge. Even if the country is under prohibition, there's a desire for more enforcement by these people. Gets 55,000 votes, but Coolidge gets 15 million and wins the election. It's worth noting about that prohibition party, because it's something we don't think about much, but it was a third or fourth or fifth party for many elections and had some effects. The Prohibition Party starts in 1869 and does have a long history of being a bit of a drag on Republicans in the 19th century. Probably the most effective year for them was 1884, when they run John St. John, the former governor of Kansas. His state had prohibition and would until 1948. He does two things in his campaign. One is he travels all across the nation on behalf of the Prohibition Party. His father had been an alcoholic. His mother suffered greatly. He raised himself, essentially, fought in the Civil War. He was an abolitionist and a supporter of bringing free blacks from bringing freed African Americans from the southern states to Kansas to welcome migrants, as he did as governor of Kansas, to anyone who would flee Jim Crow. But he was most known for his position on alcohol, which he saw as an evil. But it's 1884. Republicans don't want to lose votes. They declined to add temperance to their platform, and John St. John bolts from the party. Some say our party doesn't have money or uniforms or 80,000 torchbearers. That's very true. But we are lighting a torch that will burn forever. We have no influence, they say. Very true. We have no relationship with the railroads. Good. It would be unbecoming for us to ride in a palace car when laborers are working under the ground with barely enough to live on. Yes, John St. John, in addition to being a prohibitionist, was a working man's advocate. He linked the two issues. Liquor was a big business. It made money for the rich, but it kept workers down. And he made a point of saying at all the rallies, because it was true that presidential candidates often got transported by railroads. We pay our own fare. James Blaine and the Republicans in 1884 running against Grover Cleveland, a very tight race. They see him as a potential target. Republicans hate John St. John. Blaine is always talking about him. They have to attack him. And they point out that a vote for St. John is a vote for Democrats. In some places, St. John is burned in effigy. They called the prohibitionists cranks. But St. John is successful, probably the most successful prohibitionist candidate. He increases his party's vote total by 14 times what it had received in the 1880 election. And much to James Blaine's dismay, he gets 25,000 votes in New York, a total swing state in this election. Generally, Democrats do not vote for the Temperance Party. So votes that go to St. John are all stolen Blaine votes. Blaine loses to Cleveland in the 1884 election by 1,200 votes in New York, a win that will put Grover Cleveland in the White House. Now, it's important to say because you have that story, rum, Romanism, and rebellion. I'm trying to focus on more obscure stories here, so I don't have to get into it too much. But it's a comment made by a Blaine supporter that may turn the election because it angers Democrats in New York to really go out and vote. And but Blaine doesn't see that comment. Blaine claims he never heard the comment. That's why he never disavowed it. Blaine doesn't think that's what turned the election. Blaine's story for years afterward is that it's St. John that took those 25,000 votes and turned the election. It's exactly the equivalent of the Ralph Nader situation, the 2000 election for Democrats. In 4 years, in 1888, when Republicans do win the election, the Prohibitionist Party would get even more votes, 250,000 nationally, which suggests that either the situation's politically different in 1884, or maybe Blaine was wrong, and at least if you have a better Republican campaign, also a worse Democratic candidate at that point, a less popular Democratic candidate, you can win despite the Prohibitionists running. The next time there is any Prohibitionist candidate considered to be impactful is the 1916 contest between Woodrow Wilson and Charles Hughes. In California, the margin is 3,700 votes. The Prohibition Party gets 25,000. In New Hampshire, Wilson wins by 56 votes, and Prohibition gets 303. Those 17 electoral votes added to Hughes instead of Wilson would have made 1916, instead of 277 Wilson, it would be 260 Wilson and 271 Hughes. Puts Hughes in the White House. It's hard to blame the Prohibitionists, really. And that's not the major reason for 1916. You have many forces operating there. Because Prohibitionists throughout the turn of the century are going to get, about 200,000 or so votes in each of these elections, building off St. John's 1884 result. Even in 1920, after the Prohibition Amendment is ratified, they get 185,000 votes. But passing Prohibition does help. The Prohibition Party will go down to 20,000 in 1928. The party still exists, by the way, in various forms. In 2016, the party under Prohibition Party ran only in Arkansas, Colorado, and Mississippi. And it got 5,514 votes. That is completely meaningless to the national vote between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. But it is interesting to note that for the Prohibition Party of modern times, that's a good result. It's about, in some recent years, their vote has been less than 1,000. In 2012, for instance, they had their convention in a Holiday Inn Express in Cullman, Alabama, and got just 538 votes nationally. So it goes to show you about 2016, people were writing in, looking for a lot of other places to vote. From a candidate who didn't know he was running, and a president with almost no one to run against, to a candidate that decided not to run, but maybe or maybe not, he could have been president. He doesn't look like he'll be president now. Who am I talking about? I'm a kid from New Jersey, and I'm being asked if I should run for president. I'm thrilled by this. So told Chris Christie, Republican governor of New Jersey, to reporters who asked. This is when Christie was in office a little over a year. A U.S. prosecutor before that. He's getting asked questions, first by other candidates. Mitt Romney, Tim Pawlenty, Minnesota. But soon, big journals are interested in him. He's the GOP leader of a blue state in 2012. Yeah, he had just been elected governor in 2010, but the talk got serious. More serious than I think most know. Most people just think, it's pretty much Mitt Romney's nomination to have. No, Christie freezes New Jersey. This means that he, as a governor, tells New Jersey-based GOP donors not to donate to other people yet. This is just kind of one of those insider things, and I don't believe it's perfect and works in every case, but you have to remember the big donors, what are they donating for, right? You want to be influential with politicians, at least have their ear, or at least just be seen as a big supporter of the party. So the governor's telling you, if a state is telling you to do something, you're going to tend to listen at least for a time. A group of Iowans come to Trenton to visit Christie. Please, we don't have anyone that can beat Obama. He listens. He thanks them. He doesn't say anything. Christie tells reporters, I'm not interested. That's a no. But it's not. Not interested is not a true no. And he keeps doing things like this. He keeps saying that he's trapped up in a semantic game with the reporters. Like, what do I have to do? Commit suicide, he says at one point, to tell you I'm not interested. But there's certain words that he doesn't use, and one of them's like, I am not running for president, like no matter what, and all of that. He never says that. He was fighting with his state legislature. It's controlled by Democrats over the budget. But according to the book Double Down, and these are the same guys that wrote Game Change in 2008, good insider books, interviewing a lot of staffers. It says it goes a lot farther than that. I think it goes a lot farther than the 2012 Christie flirtation goes a lot farther. Kenneth Langor, billionaire behind the Home Depot, and his friends, other billionaires that listen to him, expressly want Christie to make a run. They'll do everything. He's not going to have to worry about money. Christie's wife, Mary Pat, is against him running for president, but when that fundraising obstacle is removed, she's much more supportive of Fox News, Roger Ailes, Rupert Murdoch. Make a point of airing a speech. Intermediaries are saying you're going to get great coverage on Fox News, which for Republicans is gold. September 4th, Christie makes a speech from the Reagan Library, and it's carried on Fox News to much acclaim. Big names, including Henry Kissinger, say, he'd make a great president. Barbara Bush calls Mary Pat Christie and says, don't worry, the White House is a great place for families. You needn't worry. In fact, it's pretty clear where the Bush family's going, now out of office, where they're going in 2012. Karl Rove calls, counters every argument that Chris Christie has. Worried about your state? Worried about leaving and campaigning for president? Clinton did it in 92. George W. Bush did it in 2000. Perry, governor of Texas, is doing it right now in 2012. Christie wasn't sure he could be president, wasn't sure he was ready. Rove answers, the guy that we have now isn't ready. Finally, he gets the call from W, and Christie and W talk for 45 minutes, about which we don't have that. So what happened? To hear Double Down tell it, and everything that Christie said about 2012, is that it was a personal decision, gut decision. Maybe he's driving in a car and just says no. So when Mitt Romney goes to see Christie and thinks it's going to be another, like, what's your timetable type discussion, he's shocked when Christie says, Mitt, I'm backing you, and I'm releasing my donors and endorsing you tomorrow. Why'd he do it? Double Down book suggests that he just wasn't ready. He felt like there was more of New Jersey to run. He'd only done 2 years as governor. But I don't know. And we know more now than they even knew when they were writing the Double Down book. One thing we know is that Christie would run in 2016. So I suspect politics is at play. People very often prefer to run for open seats. You see this, like Mario Cuomo, 92, doesn't want to run against Bush. Hillary Clinton doesn't want to run against Bush. I think Christie's the same way. He's like, I'm running up against incumbent president. Of course, he doesn't see what's coming his way, which is the New Jersey Bridgegate scandal. It's going to really destroy his chances and make his 2016 run, like, ridiculous. By the way, maybe Bridgegate paved the way for Trump. It's amazing how things work. The point of all of this is seize the day in politics. That was always the Kennedy way. Obviously, Obama followed that. In the 2012 election, it would turn out that Mitt Romney would be the candidate, pretty easily winning the nomination. Obama and Christie have a moment when they tour New Jersey after Hurricane Sandy. It may have boosted the presidential campaign of Obama in that year, or maybe it really didn't, because a lot of the predictors were wrong about how easy that election would be for President Obama. Most said it would be difficult, and it was a pretty quick election night. But Christie goes out to walk the beach with Obama to see Hurricane Sandy damage. Christie insists that he did the right thing. I'm the governor of the state. And what did you want me to do? Something clever like wearing a Romney t-shirt? I wasn't going to do that. He's the president. It might have helped him a bit, but that's the fault of the hurricane, not the governor. For his part, Mitt Romney has always said the same thing, and Mitt Romney says the same to Christie. You did the right thing. You're the governor. You have to be the governor. Didn't hurt me. Many felt it did. And then there's even one of these little mumbling rumors that appear over even an event that's on TV. So we think these things are only part of, like, 19th century, pulp press, right? Little invented rumors. But even an event that's televised that you can verify, a rumor develops that gets into the 2016 cycle that Christie hugged Obama during this meeting. And actually, it was a handshake. Greta Van Susteren, then with Fox News, has to confirm this with reviewing the videotape. It becomes a story. Christie said, I hug everybody. And in fact, I probably upset Obama because I didn't hug him. I'll make a rare political observation here. Christie and I don't see eye to eye on politics. I wouldn't be, for him as issues. And some political theater that he engaged in, yelling at teachers and principals and things like that, especially early on in his governorship. I didn't like it. I do think that he had the maybe not the presidential gravitas, but he had the kind of a working mold where if it was cultivated and better disciplined, some elements were there. Like, for instance, like right now in the 2020 atmosphere of politics, I think absolutely a governor who's a Republican would not invite an Obama Democrat to their state or wouldn't walk with them. I think he had a better sense of what correct calls to make. Was it presidential? Maybe the embryonic form of it. But his furtive 2012 campaign will just be one of those what ifs. About helping rivals. In 1884, they asked Roscoe Conkling, senator and Republican boss from New York, who hated James G. Blaine more than he hated anyone. But Blaine was now the Republican nominee. Then they asked Conkling, now that Blaine's received the nomination of your party, will you work for him? "Gentlemen," he told the reporters, "you are misinformed. I stopped practicing criminal law years ago." I want to thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed these. If you stayed with me, well, I thank you a lot. You are a superior listener to My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. Think about, we have the Patreon site. So the Patreon is simply the letters of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. It's patreon.com/MHCBUYP.
His karate lessons might not turn him into a black belt. Hi-ya! And even after band camp, he might not be the greatest musician. But with the 3% annual percentage yield you can earn on a PenFed premium online savings account, your goal of supporting his dreams...
Thanks for everything, Mom and Dad.
...will always be worth it. Apply today at PenFed.org/savings. Federally insured by NCUA. $5 minimum to open account. To receive any advertised product, you must become a member of PenFed.
PenFed's got great rates for everyone.